0. And I'm going to just warn that there's distressing images. And I'd like to pause at 0.29. All right, so do you agree that the OPS officer in this video in the back behind the ranks, the line, is using what is actually the muzzle and not the butt of what looks like a 40-millimeter chemical munition launched to beat a protester with?
Not enough for me to see what exactly is going on.
But you can see that there is a police officer in the back beating a protester with a rifle.
There is not enough for me to see what is actually happening behind
We continue
bodies.
playing the video, please.
Please. What you guys are beating him? What the fuck?
Now, I just have 3 further questions, Mr. Commissioner, and thank you for the time.
Mr. Wilson, if we could just
Keith,
play
this
that.
is our legal representation out here. He's got a little bit of info for you for the letters that have been being left on everybody's doorsteps by Ottawa City Police today. This is important information. Everybody needs to get this out. Keith?
Hi there. I'm legal counsel to the not-for-profit Freedom Convoy. The federal government released a new proclamation last night under the Emergencies Act, and the legal wording of it is clear. It doesn't say what the police are telling you it says. It clearly, the legal proclamation that was issued by the federal government continues to allow for peaceful protests. It allows for peaceful assembly. It allows for Canadians who are concerned about their charter rights and who want to bring their children to participate in the restoration of their future rights to come to Ottawa. The order says that you can only not come to Ottawa if you're going to disrupt international trade, disrupt critical infrastructure, or engage in acts of violence. No one involved in this freedom movement, none of the truckers support any of those things. So if you're thinking about doing those things, don't come and give your head a shake. Yep. We're about peaceful protests. This emergency order from the federal government does not restrict Canadians' rights of peaceful assembly. However, what we can see on the ground here is the police look to be gearing up. It looks like the federal government is going to tell the police to go and use violence against lawful protesters. And one way to stop that from happening is Canadians who are concerned about their rights and government overreach to come to Ottawa as soon as you can get here and stand with the truckers. We believe the police are reluctant to follow this. If they follow what the federal government's telling the police to do, it will be an illegal order. It will be unlawful. So if you come and stand with the protesters, it will make it harder for the police to act on what they're being told to do. And it's really important that freedom-loving Canadians get to Ottawa as soon as possible to stand with the truckers and exercise their legal charter rights of peaceful assembly.
That's fine.
We'll be here, guys. Remember, peace is the only way.
So,
Good afternoon, Superintendent Bernier. I'm Rob Kittredge, counsel for the Justice Centre for Constitutional Freedoms. Police have common law powers to exclude the public from an area in which a police operation is underway. Is that correct?
Yes?
And those powers could have been used in the clearing of the protests in Ottawa, couldn't they?
Yes?
In fact, you planned on using those powers to clear the protests, and the federal emergency declaration did not significantly impact your planning. Is that right?
I wouldn't exactly say that. Very, very hard to know what it would have been like without it.
Right. Your interview summary does say that, but I'll leave it. I'll leave that answer as is. You would have carried out the planned police operation whether the government declared a public order emergency or not, though. Isn't that right?
Correct. The planning and the concept of operation was already in place, and I didn't have any knowledge that an Emergencies Act was going to be put in place.
Counsel for Canada earlier on today put it to you that, and I'm paraphrasing a bit, you never know whether your use of a common law exclusion zone will hold up in court if it's challenged after the fact. Do you remember that question?
Yes.
If police proceeded as planned and relied on common law exclusion zone powers to clear the protest, the fact that those powers might have been challenged after the fact wouldn't change the fact that the protests had already been cleared, would it?
That is correct.
All right. So would you agree that the federal emergency power to create exclusion zones may have been helpful to police, but it was not necessary?
Once again, I think it was beneficial.
Beneficial, but not necessary.
Correct.
Thank you. Counsel for Canada showed you a letter dated February 17th, 2022, earlier on today, which appeared to be a letter from OPP Commissioner Carrique to tow truck drivers. You had never seen that letter before it was shown to you today, is that right?
Correct.
You have no direct knowledge of whether that letter was ever even sent to tow truck drivers, do you?
Correct.
And until you were shown the letter today, you didn't believe that the police had used the powers granted under the Emergencies Act to compel towing services, isn't that right?
Correct. Myself and my whole command table.
Right. Your planning to clear the protests didn't rely on the emergency power to compel tow truck services, correct?
That was my belief at the time.
All right. And in fact, tow trucks were...
That was the information that is provided through Inspector Springer from Kirk Richardson.
Great. You briefly mentioned when speaking to Counsel for Canada that you personally saw...
My observation, because I would look out and I'd see the trucks out there.
Right. So would you agree that the federal emergency power to compel towing services may have been helpful to police and maybe beneficial to police, but it wasn't necessary to enable police to clear the protests, was it?
Yes. However, with a caveat that we were having challenges. We were having a hard time up until that time on the 13th. So prior to the 13th, I would have said we could have used some help with that. But as things materialized on the 13th, I was satisfied that we were good.
And you were satisfied that we were good. You're satisfied that the federal emergency power to compel tow trucks wasn't necessary.
Correct.
Thank you. Interim Chief Bell testified pretty emphatically, and I quote, "In the absence of the invocation of the Emergencies Act, the OPS, the OPP, the RCMP, as part of a unified command, were going to clear the protests." Would you agree with that statement?
Could you repeat that question again, please?
In the absence of the invocation of the Emergencies Act, the OPS, the OPP, the RCMP, as part of a unified command, were going to clear the protests. Do you agree with that statement?
Yes.
Numerous other OPP and OPS witnesses have testified that the federal emergency powers may have been helpful to police in various ways, but they were not necessary. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Those are my questions.
I'm not sure if you can see me. My name is Eva Krajewska, and I'm counselor for the Canadian Civil Liberties Association.
Yes, we can see you. Go ahead.
Perfect, thank you. Superintendent, when you took over as event commander on February 10th, that's what I understand from your evidence today,
Yes.
and your task was to prepare an operational plan.
Yes.
And at that time, between February 10th and February 13th, when you were preparing the operational plan, was it your assessment that the OPS had the necessary legal tools and powers to execute that operational plan?
Yes.
And it was not your assessment that you required any additional legal tools or any additional legal powers?
I would say they were beneficial, but
Okay, I just want to bring you to OPS 10443. I just want to, just to situate you, it looks at the top like there's a list of attendees and it appears that your name is on it. Is that correct?
Yes.
And I know it doesn't have a date on it, so perhaps if we just scroll down a little bit and we look, yeah, that's great, where you're under at NCRCC now, there's a statement, an update from you. Does that situate you in terms of around what time frame this would have been?
So I'm going to think this is around the 12th, 13th.
So were you the event commander then at the time of this meeting?
Based on what I'm reading here, the fact that I'm in progress of setting up command table, I would be the event commander.
Okay. Can we scroll please down to the bottom of page 2? That's perfect. Thank you. And just if we start under the first redaction, there's a question being posed by John Steinbachs about closing bridges. And then under it, you see Lucas is saying not going to close it right now. Do you remember this conversation?
Yes.
And do you remember what Lucas's plan was in relation to the closures that we're seeing being discussed here?
So what it had to do is coming up with mitigation strategies because of the lawfulness of, at the time of closing down a bridge. We had a plan that we were working with our traffic section to reduce the flow in and control and divert away from the downtown core.
Okay. And if you look under that, we see a comment. There's one by Bell, and then under that, we have slowly, it says, bridge closed, wants it done, close everything, not debating. Do you recall that comment being made during that meeting?
Yes.
And what did you take that comment to mean?
That he wanted the bridge closed.
Irrespective of Lucas's plan? Okay.
Correct.
I want to move on. Thank you, Mr. Clerk. We can take that down.
If we go further down. Okay, let's go further down. Yeah. And before that point was where they wanting to get legal advice about the mayor's deal. If we just go up a little bit. Yeah, there we go. Now I lost it, but there was a point about seeking legal advice.
Yeah, I know the point. You showed it to me before.
Yeah,
yes.
exactly. So are you saying that there was still a consideration at this time to continue moving vehicles?
Well, the next morning,
Deef and I represent the City of Ottawa. So you were tasked on February 7th with overseeing PLT and POU, correct?
correct,
And at the time, event commander was Superintendent Patterson, right?
correct.
And February 7th, that's the date after the events that this commission has heard a fair bit about at Coventry involving PLT, correct?
Correct.
And just to close the loop on that, I'm going to ask Mr. Clerk to bring up OPS 408055. I think we might need that a bit bigger. And then can we scroll down, please, Mr. Clerk, all the way to the bottom? Perfect, right there. This is an email from Peter McKenna. I apologize, I don't know his rank.
Peter's a staff sergeant.
Staff Sergeant McKenna to Inspector Lucas, dated February 6, right?
Correct.
And here, Staff Sergeant McKenna is explaining what occurred at Coventry, right?
Correct.
And in the second paragraph from the bottom, he says, oh, not second, it was the second. Third paragraph from the bottom, he says, PLT have made incredible headway, but they now feel absolutely betrayed. Work needs to be done to reassure them and explain what happened. These members are chosen as they have a high level of emotional intelligence that goes along with a very determined work ethic. and goes on to say what pride they take in their work. Staff Sergeant McKenna continues, what has happened is an incredible blow to them and the program's future, and provides more details. He even refers to an individual explaining that they're ashamed to wear this uniform right now. Now, this was the day before you took over responsibility, but I take it you were aware of this.
I was aware of it the next day, yes.
Right. And so it's fair to say that by February 8th, while PLT may have been communicating with the protesters, certainly there had been a breakdown in trust.
At that location, yes.
And we've heard some evidence that it may have affected other locations. Is that fair?
It may have.
Right. Now, you've explained that PLT was working with the group or discussing with the group at the Rideau-Sussex intersection to move from that intersection onto Wellington, correct?
Big hay bales piled around downtown and also open fires and so forth. Those were dangerous, was it not?
Yes.
Many propane tanks, large numbers of propane tanks up together, as well as large numbers of jerry cans. That was very dangerous.
Yes.
And in addition to the hay bales and the propane tanks and the open fires and the jerry cans, in the evenings, there were fireworks going off very close to and binging off of apartment buildings. You were aware of that?
Yes.
And that was very dangerous.
Yes. Yes, it was.
And Superintendent, the convoy protesters were free to do all of this in downtown Ottawa because at the time, Ottawa Police Service did not have capacity for enforcement. Is that fair?
In the beginning, certainly we had a resource problem for sure. Absolutely.
Well, but those kinds of activities were going on right until the final operation, correct? There was some efforts around the jerry cans.
There were efforts on all fronts. I mean, I went out on the street on foot and was involved in some enforcement, particularly with a fireworks situation. But there were difficult scenarios because there were large crowds and there were officer safety issues when we did some of that enforcement work.
And you would agree with me, Superintendent, we are all very fortunate here in Ottawa that no one was seriously harmed or even killed, including the protesters themselves, because of these dangerous activities.
Yes, there could have been injuries.
Serious injuries with all that flammable material.
Yes.
And so the fact that the Ottawa Police couldn't prevent much of that activity, the convoy protesters were free to engage in those activities that created that risk.
We tried to take efforts to curb those things, and we did do enforcement where possible, but it wasn't perfect.
Said that Tom Marazzo had somewhat control over 322 trucks. Do you remember that?
The Freedom Convoy Group is how I would remember that.
Would you agree it was about 322 trucks?
That was one of them that came up on a document, yes.
Right. All right. So on February 7th, you have your PLT team engaging with Tom Marazzo, is that right?
Correct.
Right. And you aware, and Tom Marazzo made this clear, that on February 7th, you'd lost confidence in your liaison officers in trying to deal with this?
I was not aware of that.
All right. Did your police liaison officers ever report to you that on February 7th, Tom Marazzo specifically requested of both OPS and OPP that an inspector-level officer be made available for the negotiation to move the trucks because he wasn't getting anywhere with rank and file?
No. We had made arrangements for him to meet with a city official as he had requested. I don't know about the other comments that you've made.
All right. So the PLT officers that were working under you never reported that to you?
No.
All right. Now, I want to talk to you about February 8th. Now, there was discussions, that was when the first discussions with respect to removing the concrete barriers, et cetera, and moving the trucks took place. It was the first attempt to clear Rodeo and Sussex. Do you remember that?
At Rideau and Sussex, yes.
Yeah. And all of the concrete barriers, both in the residential area as well as on Wellington, they were all still in place at that time?
Yes.
Right.
Well, I'll be honest with you, I can't confirm that. We may have moved some. I wasn't keeping track of every Jersey barrier in the core.
Right. And Tom had essentially met, or Mr. Marazzo had met with these individuals from the city and from OPS to negotiate moving the trucks on to Wellington. But I understand it from your notes, et cetera, you knew at that time that wasn't going to happen.
They were leaving or moving.
Right. And at no time did you have authorization from the city, not the OPS, on February 8th, 2022 to move the barriers, did you?
No. Well, we hadn't requested that yet.
Okay. So wouldn't it have made sense in trying to deal with this, to discuss with the city prior to meeting with Mr. Marazzo, that you're going to move these barriers to get these trucks out of the residential area and we're going to go into this negotiation with the plan? Wouldn't have that made more sense?
Well, once we'd reached, if we had reached some sort of agreement, we had city crews available to us 24/7. That wasn't difficult to move a barrier.
Right. So, and you're aware that Wellington is well within the city of Ottawa's jurisdiction, it doesn't belong to Parliament.
Correct.
Right. So at any time on February 8th, 2022, there was nothing stopping OPS in the city from moving the barriers, letting the trucks leave the residential area and letting them go on to Wellington, was there?
You're referring to Rideau and Sussex, which
Correct.
That's not necessarily a residential area. That's a commercial area there.
Right. So you agree that there was nothing stopping you or the city or OPS from allowing that to happen on February 8th, 2022?
It could have been done, but we didn't reach an agreement, and the group there didn't want to move.
I understand that may be the evidence. Where did you didn't ever hear from anyone from that group? You didn't speak to them, and they didn't say to you that they...
A video on the 13th of February 2022. The following is a summary. The letter is spreading around that trucks will move is a lie. Blacked Out advised the truckers that no one leaves. It is part of the counter-protest shit. It is all a lie. Do not leave Ottawa. Do not leave the residential areas. Do not back out. You are good to go. Stand your ground. And it continues. Do you see that information?
I do.
So would you agree with me then that this video being posted by an organizer suggests that there was no coalescence or agreement amongst the list of organizers that my friend Mr. Miller mentioned to you a few moments ago?
I would agree that there was some dissension amongst the groups.
Dissension amongst the groups. And so in fact, thank you, Mr. Clerk. Your witness statements mentions that the protest leadership clearly had not achieved the consensus they claimed they were going to have.
Correct.
So in fact, there was no core group of organizers. PLT was just doing what it could with whoever would talk to them.
We tried to identify the larger group.
OPS 409429. And in particular, I would just ask you about the last page of that report. The last paragraph. In summary, just because I'm short of time, but I would recommend to the commission to read the entire report. There are comments and posts online stating that organizing and planning for a proposed DC convoy, that's Washington, DC, is beginning to cement, taking into account the events in Ottawa, the anger and hostility driving much of the campaign, the protest movement's acceptance and support of conspiracies and misinformation, and implicit and explicit links to extremist groups, which are identified in the report, or in the draft Intel report. There are some glaring comparisons to the Capitol insurrection on January 6th, 2021. Did you agree with that at the time?
This is I mean, I see the comments that are made there. This is a private company. It's not a recognized intelligence group that we would have dealt with back then. I know that company had sent information to us. I think they were looking for us to get involved in their product.
Were you concerned of the similarities?
Well, I mean, you know, there were people who made comments between us and what had happened in the U.S. State Capitol. You know, there were similarities to what occurred. I mean, we didn't have the same storming of the Hill type that the Americans had. We had, you know, vehicles camped out on roadways. So there were differences. We didn't have the same level of violence and mischief that had occurred down in Washington.
And we know that now.
We know that now, exactly. We know that now.
It was a risk that was on your mind at the time.
Yes.
Folks, if you want to actually be kept up to date on what's happening here at the inquiry by heading over to revolutionnews.ca/emergency act commission. That's revolutionnews.ca/emergency act commission. At that page, you will see my live tweets and, of course, some clips that are actually occurring at the inquiry. And, of course, here, folks, while you're there, please consider chipping in by heading over to donorbox.org/emergency act commission. That's donorbox.org/emergency act commission. And, of course, here, folks, once again, if you could actually chip in here by kicking a buck or two, that will be greatly appreciated, as it will help me cover my travel expenses, covering the Emergency Act inquiry here at the nation's capital. Thank you so much.